Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We have a first-time guest today, and literally one of my favorite politicians of the last 40 years. We don't have a lot of politicians on here, and one of the reasons we don't is because most politicians lie, and most politicians want to get reelected, so it's better to have them when they're done seeking office and when they've written a good book or co-written a good book. So Phil Gramm, I'm not going to give you his whole resume, but he was a senator, he was a congressman, he has a PhD in economics. He's a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute, and he and Don Boudreaux, who's one of my other favorite economists, have a new book coming out. It's called The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. Senator Gramm, Dr. Gramm, Phil Gramm, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you, Jonah. I always enjoy your program today and everything you write and say. So it's a big deal for me to be on this program.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. And I should say just because it has the virtue of being true, and I feel like I should say it, you practice the same, you follow the same advice I did and married up. And you have an absolutely lovely wife. So we'll start as we always do on here with authors. What's your book about?
Well, my book is about why people hold very different opinions in terms of the role of government in a free society. Thomas Jefferson said, "Good men with the same facts are prone to disagree." But I have found over my academic and political career that when people hold very different views, that normally those views spring from having conceptions about the world they live in, conceptions about how the world works. And so, for example, if you look at Thune and Schumer, the two leaders of the Senate, a Republican and Democrat, you would say, well, they differ because one is a conservative Republican and one is a modern Democrat liberal. But if you ask them, what happened to workers during the Industrial Revolution at the birth of capitalism? Or what is your opinion about the progressive era regulations in American history? Or what caused the Great Depression? Or is foreign trade harmful to America? Did it hollow out American manufacturing in the post-war period? What caused the financial crisis? And if you ask them those 5 periods in American history, and then you ask them 2 contemporary issues, income inequality and poverty, that you're going to find that they have totally different conceptions about what happened in those 5 historical periods, what the reality is in terms of income inequality and poverty. And so, in a very real sense, what divides people's opinion is their perception of the world and how it works. And that's based often on very limited amount of information. So what we try to do is take those 5 historical periods and the 2 contemporary issues and first present the undisputed facts about the period or the issue, and then what we perceive to be the myth. And then we set about trying to debunk the myth. And the Industrial Revolution is a perfect example. Nobody disputes the fact that in the Industrial Revolution, you had an extraordinary burst of productive capacity. Where the dispute comes is who benefited from it. People who tend to believe that the government should play a quite significant role in society tend to believe that during the Industrial Revolution that the worker became poorer, was exploited. That's Karl Marx's view, even though Karl Marx was the greatest uh, 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 in terms of his opinion of capitalism and its capacity to produce goods and services, was its greatest advocate in terms of production. The problem was who got the benefits. Well, what we do is present the solid facts that the Industrial Revolution, which really sprang from the Enlightenment, where you had a situation where in the Middle Ages, in fact, for 1,000 years, people didn't really benefit from their effort or their thrift because they had to share it with the crown, the guild, the city, the church, the village, and the church. And the Enlightenment established the fact that people own their own labor and their own thrift and had the right to benefit from it. So if you look at a map of at a graph of world production, for 1,000 years, it's basically flat. People lived like their grandparents had lived. And then all of a sudden, about 1800, production just takes off. And what we show, we present the whole argument about exploitation of labor. We present all of the heart-rending literature. Oh God, that bread should be so dear and flesh and blood so cheap. um, but then we present the hard facts about what happened in the Industrial Revolution to income, education, child labor, morbidity, mortality. And the reality is that the 18th and 19th centuries were the great years that transformed the world as it was experienced by working people. It was a great worker revolution in history. And so we take that approach to each of those issues. I think I'm high on the book. Obviously, I wrote it, but I've written a lot of things, as you know, and I hope it will induce people to really take a look at the alternative information that's out there. I have tried my whole life, and this is hard to do, to be open to new information. I believe what I believe based on the world I grew up in and the world that I have seen and learned about. But if I find out that I don't have my facts straight, I've always at least held the possibility that I would change my opinion. And I never had any problem in politics in saying when someone said, well, you thought this back then, you think this now. I never had a problem saying, well, yeah, I'm not as ignorant as I used to be. But it's a thing that many people have a hard time with. But I think the book is interesting. And I think when you look at the argument we make, that at a minimum, you've got to say that the case for more government is weaker than conventional wisdom holds, and that you can make an argument that it's invalid. And that's really what the book is about.
So I want to get to some of that stuff. I particularly want to talk to you about the New Deal stuff a little bit and some contemporary things. But just on the Industrial Revolution, I've been doing some work on that period for a project that I'm working on, and there really was this explosion in statistical analysis in like the first half of the 1800s, because all of those techniques were available for the first time. And one of the things I'm trying to get my head around is all of the writing, not just like the Dickensian stuff, but like the chronicling of poverty was just the quantity of people writing about urban poverty, about the plight of the urban poor was enormous back then. And the assumption back then was that this was all caused essentially by the Industrial Revolution. And I think that's that contemporaneous reporting at the time created that image going forward, that the one that you're dealing with today. And so the question is, was there there are two things at odds. One is everyone sees all this poverty, and at the same time, the population explodes, which means that there was more food and more resources for people and longer life expectancies and less child morbidity and that kind of stuff. Is it one of these things that because you could measure it, it now seemed new in a way that it hadn't existed before? Or is it that the people who came from the farms were now visible in cities? I mean, what explains that people were seeing this and reporting it at the time?
Well, I think it's two things. I think you've got to remember that economic growth and progress is creative destruction. That when something new comes, it ends up pushing out the inefficient and pushing out the old order. And so when the Industrial Revolution came to Britain and into the United States, suddenly the landed gentry, which had controlled Parliament and controlled society, was losing power. And the people who worked in their fields were leaving to go to the factories. And there was a little bit of nostalgia in here from the veranda of the manor house. The humble hut across the creek looked romantic, but it was a mud hut with manure piles outside, and
sometimes
often with
inside.
often and live animals inside in the
Yeah.
winter, and often 15 or 20 people living in the structure, and going to the city meant freedom. Now, there were problems. London saw its population expand sevenfold in 100 years. And this is something it wasn't prepared for. But there's another factor at work. The landed gentry basically made up most of the literary uh, population and hired the rest. And so much of what we get from the Industrial Revolution writing is somewhat propaganda from the rural gentry that is losing. And remember, in 1840, so many people had moved to the city that the Corn Laws in Britain, which had given protection to the landed gentry and made them rich at the expense of the consumer, they were repealed and opening up import of food, which dramatically increased the well-being of working people. And so there was a massive shift in power. But the second and probably most important reason we look at the Industrial Revolution as a period of squalor and want is from where we sit. After the revolution, it was squalor and want.
Right.
It was a higher state than man had ever lived in on this planet. Quantifiably so, because of all the statistics you're talking about that were coming out for the first time. But compared to the world we live in, it was squalor. And also, don't forget, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the idea that poverty could ever be abated, much less eliminated, the idea that you could have material well-being at the level we take for granted was unthinkable.
Yeah.
Unthinkable. And so by 1900, it had become thinkable. And so people started to write about it and started to demand it because society, but not because people were poorer relative to what they'd been before the Industrial Revolution, but because they were so much richer.
Right.
Because now it was possible to believe that the majority of children didn't have to die before they were 5 years old, that people didn't have to work in the fields or in the factories at 8 or 9 years old. Those things were unthinkable in 1800. They were very much expected by 1900. And that's where I think we get the perception. And historians, especially in Britain, are beginning to change their view about the Industrial Revolution. That it really was sort of the dawning of freedom for workers, that they saw not only material well-being by moving to the cities, but freedom. The end of their dependence on the landed gentry. So, there's some people who want to believe that exploitation occurred, but the facts don't bear it out.
Yeah, and I mean, we can acknowledge that, of course, there are going to be anecdotal horror stories because you're talking about vast sweeps of time and place and societies working out, as you say, the creative destruction and all these things. That is not an argument for being a net negative. But when you talk about the existence of poverty as assumed to be a permanent thing, I often tell people that poverty was, people saw it the way they talk about identity politics now, right? That it was they thought poverty was as immutable as race or gender. It was just something. Poor people are born poor, and they've always been poor, and there always will be poor. And it didn't occur to people to think that this is a situation that can be really be remedied. The poor deserve pity, but that's their plight. And it always reminded me of James Burnham's line that problems without solutions aren't really problems. That's the way the poor were seen. Yeah. All right, so let's.
Well, let me respond to that,
Yeah,
Jonah,
sure.
if I can. In the pre-industrial world, poverty was the plight of ordinary people.
Right.
But after the Enlightenment, which unleashed a human energy when society came to recognize that you own your own labor and you own the fruits of your thrift, everything changed. And as a result, expectations changed. And clearly there were people, you can imagine London going from 1 million people to 7 million people in 100 years. There were a lot of problems. But don't forget, people left the country and came to the city voluntarily.
Right.
They voted with their feet for freedom and opportunity. Did it turn out to be a great thing for every single one of them? No. But did it turn out to be a flight to freedom and opportunity for the very vast majority? The answer is yes.
Yeah. Yoni Applebaum has this great book called Stuck out about basically about housing, and he really wants to explain to people that, like, the tenements on the Lower East Side, we should look at them like the Little House on the Prairie from the Laura Ingalls books. These were places where people were desperate to live and make a life of themselves. They were not
Yeah.
seen as hellholes, at least by the people who lived them. All right, but I got to get to. I'm going to jump the gun here because it's just so relevant and timely. Even though we're going to hold on to this podcast to closer to pub date, there's a certain politician in Washington who's been saying that America was never richer than under the tariff regime of President McKinley. As someone who is more associated, there are very few politicians who are more associated with limited and small government than Phil Gramm in my mind. And so I can understand why you might be nostalgic for the size of government in, in the McKinley years. But surely you have views on this notion that America had never been richer when it enjoyed the fruits, so to speak, of protectionism.
Well, I have something better than views. I have facts. Look, let me talk about McKinley and then talk about the long history of American tariffs. McKinley, as a congressman, introduced the McKinley tariff, which was adopted in 1890. And the political reaction to that tariff was so overwhelmingly negative that 3 months later in the election, McKinley was defeated with 72 other Republican House members, and there was a wholesale change in policy. When McKinley came back as president, he had learned something by being hit upside the head by a 2x4. And so he viewed the objective of trade policy in the American government as being trying to mutually reduce trade barriers. As he said in his final speech, in fact, that the future is about opening markets, that commercial wars are losing propositions. And so President Trump has chosen someone to idolize as an example of what he would like to have as policy poorly, in that McKinley, by the time he was president, would have greatly disagreed with President Trump. Now, here's the problem that protectionists have. When President Trump implemented his tariffs, they achieved none of his objectives. They didn't lower the trade deficit. They didn't increase employment and manufacturing.
You're talking about the first term, just to be clear.
This was
right?
the first term.
Okay.
They didn't increase employment and manufacturing relative to total employment in the economy. They didn't expand economic growth. They worked in exactly the opposite direction. In the 20th century, protectionism was a disaster, both economically and politically, centered around the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. So a protectionist can't go back to the 20th century to find an example because there's not one. So they go back to the 19th century, and it works for them to some extent because people don't understand that in the 19th century, the federal government didn't have the power to tax income, and its principal source of revenues was tariffs. But government was tiny, so it worked. But Americans have always hated tariffs and have not tolerated them for any long period of time. And it started in the colonies with a molasses tariff in 1733, and then the Townshend Acts that produced taxation without representation cries from colonists, and it was overturned within 3 years. And then the Tea Act, which produced the Boston Tea Party and was effectively repealed at Concord and Lexington as the war started. And if you look throughout American history, people talk about Alexander Hamilton as a proponent of tariffs, but when you look at the facts, not true. He thought the government should engage in some industrial policy to develop technology, but he was very skeptical of tariffs because they encouraged inefficiency. And also because you didn't collect money on goods that weren't imported into the country or smuggled into the country. And the demand for money for public works ultimately produced the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. And so negative was the reaction to that tariff that it helped elect Andrew Jackson and a wholesale turnover in Congress. And for the next 30 years, tariffs fell by 70%. And by the time the Civil War started, we had among the lowest tariffs in the world. And during that period, America industrialized at 6.2% a year, never matched. And then you had the Civil War and taxes and spending. But from 1870 to 1890, tariffs fell by 30% and industrialization grew. So that's really the history of America. And as I always said in the Senate when we debated this issue, to me, free trade is about freedom. Well, who gives government the right to say, as they do, that I got to pay twice the world price for sugar so that 4,300 sugar producers can be rich? Well, government does that. The American government does that today. But they have no right to do it. It's theft from consumers. It's taking food out of babies' mouths to give to people that have got political influence. And throughout history, especially American history, protectionism has been an effort to benefit the few at the cost of the many. And the many often don't know that they're paying the tax, but the few know they're getting the benefits. And that's what tariffs are about. And why is there so much just commitment to jobs in manufacturing? The average wage in manufacturing is now below the average wage in service areas. This mania is underway because industrial workers in swing states are the swing voter. And just as agriculture was a swing voter in the 19th century, and as a result, in the 20th century, and as a result, we had totally irrational farm programs. And so I think that's a factual picture. Now there's another side of the story, but it's more mythology than it is based on facts.
So I'm trying to keep the punditry out of here, but I am curious. One of my biggest gripes is that Congress has outsourced its powers and responsibilities to the courts and the executive branch, and free traders had a good argument for a long time for fast track authority for presidents to get that stuff out of Congress, because one of the historic problems with tariffs, as you know, is that it is such an inducement for corruption and special dealing that Congress was like, we can't trust ourselves with this power. Let's give it to the president. And now we have a president who thinks that sort of self-dealing and corruption stuff is a feature, not a bug. Do you think Congress should take back the power? Do you think it should take the back power permanently? How do you think about how Congress has responded to all of this?
Well, let me respond on the tariffs first.
Sure.
What happened when Franklin Roosevelt was elected was that Congress wanted to get out of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, but many members didn't want to vote to repeal it. And so they passed a Reciprocal Trade Act that gave Franklin Roosevelt the ability to negotiate with other nations to lower tariffs and to back us out of Smoot-Hawley. And for 13 presidents in a row, Congress gave them that power, and they used it with very few exceptions to do exactly what Roosevelt did. Now, protectionists like to point out that, well, we weren't always perfect. Even Ronald Reagan had an agreement to voluntarily limit imports of automobiles for a short period of time. Well, look, I was there. Okay, Reagan hated protectionism. He once called protectionism in things you had to do politically kissing the pig. It's a good term. So anyway, remember, Congress had just bailed out Chrysler. Mm-hmm. The post-war period was over. We had had 9.2% inflation for 9 years. And you had this scream from Detroit that Japanese automobiles, which were at the time better and cheaper, because we'd had a monopoly since the end of World War II because the worldwide productive capacity had been destroyed by the war.
Right.
But by 1975, it had come back with a vengeance. When that first Toyota Corolla rolled off the ship in Los Angeles, it was a big change because it was better, it was cheaper. And so Reagan was afraid that Congress would pass a massive protectionist bill, and knowing that Smoot-Hawley had never been repealed, it wasn't a path he wanted to walk down. And so he worked out an agreement which let him kill the effort to legislate. And it was governing at its best. It was kissing the pig, but the alternative was worse. So now the issue about presidents having too much power, I couldn't agree more. The founders wrote the Constitution to try to make it so elections don't really matter. That the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, protects our basic freedoms, the things that are worth fighting for and dying for. And so we had elections, and your candidate might win or lose. You might even cry that night about it. But nobody came the next day and took your house.
Right.
Or put you in prison. But what has happened now, and the reason was our whole system of checks and balances, and the fact that there was sort of a tradition that you didn't make dramatic changes until they'd been ratified by voters over several elections. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, now we have, and it really started mostly with Obama, and then grew under Trump, and then grew under Biden, and now has grown further under Trump. That executive authority has become so much a part of the system that elections really matter. And remember, all over the world, people copied our Constitution, but it never worked. Why? Because the loser wouldn't sit down. Mm-hmm. People weren't willing to accept the results of elections because they mattered too much. And what I would like to see Congress do And a good time to do it would be before a presidential election to basically uh, pass legislation limiting executive authority and requiring a vote in Congress on significant actions, or at least a veto power from Congress. So, yeah, I think it's a very big problem. And it's not just Trump. It's for the last 4 presidencies now, this process has been building. It's a bipartisan problem. I remember when I was on the banking committee and I became chairman, I, for the first time, read the Defense Production Act, which was under the jurisdiction of the banking committee. And I thought, my God, under this act, the president could virtually do anything. And so I had the idea that we should limit that power. And when George W. Bush became president, I went to see him and I explained the problem. And I had talked to Republicans on the committee and Zell Miller, who was a Democrat. So we had a majority about changing the Defense Production Act to require some congressional action declaring an emergency before the president could do all these things. And so President Bush was interested in it, but by the time it got into the bureaucracy, their sort of view was, why should we take power away from ourselves?
Yeah.
And so when Republicans are in power, the Democrats are very much for doing what we're talking about. When Democrats are in power, Republicans are very much in favor of doing it, but it never gets done. And I think you've got to do it when nobody is in power, when you're about to have an election. It's the only way that I can conceive that it could be done. But this is a very real problem. The founders never intended the president to have the authority he has, in my opinion.
No, you're singing from my hymnal here. I want to get to the New Deal stuff, but just one last question on the politics stuff. You've got to have a lot of friends still in Republican politics. You still got to talk to them from time to time. I've been talking for years about what I call the closet normals, who, when they're not on TV and when they're not on the radio and the mic and cameras aren't on, they're still pretty much conventional Reaganite Republican guys. And they, for the most part, agree that protectionism is silly, right? They might have special pleading for some interest in their district or whatever, but they get the arguments and they agree with the arguments for the most part. The closet normal caucus has been shrinking over the last decade. And so I'm curious, what do you think that there is more room in the Republican Party in a post-Trump era, whether that ends for actuarial reasons or political reasons? Do you think the Republican Party is going to snap back a little bit to the party of Phil Gramm and Ronald Reagan, or do you think that it's on a different trajectory now and it's going to be a long time before it gets back to normal?
You're right. I still have a lot of friends there. I don't admit it publicly, obviously. No, I find congressmen are more interested in my views when I don't tell them, and they have to ask. But look, there's no way that these tariffs could have passed Congress. I would say there are only 4 or 5 Republican senators that really believe in these tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the president and the vice president believe in them. Mm-hmm. And so why haven't they spoken out more? Well, they're beginning to. But, we're just 100 days into the administration. election. There's a sort of a tradition of the honeymoon period, give the guy a chance. But look, if the president does not straighten out this tariff business, he's going to drive the economy into a recession, and we're going to lose the midterm elections.
Mm-hmm.
That's obvious to a blind man. And so I think you will see in the next 100 days more and more Republicans speaking out, in part because they think, the president's had an opportunity to tell us what he wants to do. Now we've got to state our position. And because of the election that's coming up in 18 months. As I argued before Trump ever took the oath, when members of the Congress asked me my opinion about these tariffs, what I said to them is, look, guys, I can tell you based on my whole experience, and I spent a lot of time studying these issues, that tariffs don't work. And they lower economic growth, they lower wages, they lower productivity. And they're counterproductive. But forget all that. Soon Trump's right. Even if he were right, the positive effect won't be felt before the 2026 elections.
Mm-hmm.
So even if he were right, you're going to get all the negative impact in the election and none of the positive impact. And the fact that he's wrong means there's never going to be a positive impact.
Right.
So you're going to see people speaking out partly because it's time and partly for self-preservation.
Yeah. I have friends who are much more pro-protectionism than I am, and even they will concede that there are smarter ways of doing it. You announce way in advance that you're going to have a tariff, so investment can be and planning can be done. You can you do it gradually on a schedule that is clear to everybody. Just doing it all on Liberation Day just caused utter chaos, and then changing the standard day to day is
well,
it's bad policy badly implemented. Is my point.
And declaring a trade war against the world.
Yeah. Except El Salvador, we got them in our column.
It's this is a very serious problem, and uncertainty kills investment.
Yeah.
And uncertainty corrodes consumption. And unless something is done, the obvious way out of this is to take, to this point, Trump has used the term reciprocal trade in a distorted way. To him, reciprocal trade is we raised your tariff and we're going to leave it there unless you do what we say. Okay? That's not what McKinley meant by reciprocal trade agreements. Reciprocal trade agreements is where we say to the Japanese and the Europeans, you take away your tariffs on American automobiles, we will take away the tariff on trucks and SUVs in America. 25%, by the way. You say to the countries in Latin America, you lower your trade barriers, we get rid of the sugar program. You say to people who are in the shipping industry, you lower your trade barriers and we get rid of the Jones Act.
Right.
So, people have this. I have congressmen who come up to me every day and say, we have the lowest tariffs in the world. I say to them, where did you get that? Well, it's what they say. I said, well, it's not true. The European Union has lower average tariffs than we do. The Japanese have lower average tariffs than we do. But there's so much misinformation out there because trade is a hard issue for people to understand. I don't understand why it is, but it is.
All right, so I want to get back to the book. If I haven't gotten this far into it yet, I've been on the road and don't have a copy in front of me. But if I was going to talk about myths of the progressive era and of the New Deal, the one of the progressive era that I've written the most about is this idea that government and big business were locked in an intense battle, and that big business fought regulation tooth and nail, which I don't think is true. And then on the New Deal, it's just the basic idea, which they still teach in every high school, as far as I can tell, that the New Deal ended the Great Depression and got us out of the Great Depression, which I also don't think is true. So what are the myths, the misconceptions that you think about the progressive era? And then second question about the New Deal.
Well, the first myth of progressive era regulation is the idea that the American consumer was exploited by the growth of nationwide businesses. There was a movement against A&P, the big grocery chain, to protect small grocers. Well, antitrust is supposed to be about protecting the consumer. Uh, uh, Much of the progressive era regulation turned into protecting other businesses. And secondly, these big industries were producing more and more product at lower prices for the consumer, and the consumer was a beneficiary. We spend a good amount of space dealing with the whole issue of the slaughter industry in Chicago, and how the famous book, The Jungle, was fabrication, and how even the new government agency that was created to regulate the slaughter industry in Chicago issued reports showing that the book was completely invalid, that the stories never happened, and that in fact the real danger in pollution and corrupting the food supply was the hog butchered in the back room of a rural grocery store. That the consolidation of the slaughter industry lowered prices and dramatically improved sanitation. So it was just a case of a novelist who was an avowed socialist, wrote a book, fiction book, that people who wanted to take action to eliminate the ability of big companies to sell at lower prices used as an argument for regulation. And of course, what happened in the progressive era regulation, as we all know, is ultimately business got control of the regulations, and prices and policy was set to benefit the very people that were being regulated. And that's where Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy come in, because their deregulation of the trucks, the trains, the airlines, and communications, all of those deregulatory policies created more competition and dramatically changed America. You got to remember, in the Carter era, and Carter is very much criticized for many things, and many of them are justified, but he took on special interest and deregulated major sectors of the economy. And that deregulation and improved efficiency, which cut airline rates in half, which cut the cost of shipping dramatically, and which opened up competition that created these huge tech companies of today. His deregulation and overturning of progressive era regulation basically is what produced the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in terms of the Depression, I think it's one of the best chapters in the book. Basically, the Depression was a failure of monetary policy that then was exacerbated by the massive uncertainty that Franklin Roosevelt created with the explosion of government involvement in the economy and the granting of various monopolies, and the fact that he literally scared people out of investing.
Mm-hmm.
And people talk about, well, the Depression ended with a war. Well, it didn't. Unemployment ended with a war, but it wasn't until Eisenhower was president that the level of consumption and the equity market, the stock markets, reached their pre-29 levels, not until the 1950s. So I think it's a very good chapter, and it clears up a lot of things in my mind. And I don't think, again, factually, I think it all stands up to scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
The question obviously is, what weighting do you put on various things? And that, again, depends on your view of the world. And it's hard to overstate how much that affects people's opinion. I'll just give you one example. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. My brother was the first person in my extended family, probably 1,600 people, who ever graduated from high school. And he's the first person to go to college and graduate from college. Now, if somebody is going to try to convince me of the Bernie Sanders argument that the system is rigged, that you can't get ahead, I mean, hell, you got to get up mighty early in the morning. I mean, it's maybe there could be data that could convince me that that's true, but boy, it's going to be hard because of my life experience. As I tell my grandchildren, ordinary people like us would be peasants in any other country in the world. Only in America could ordinary people do the things we are doing. And that's so important for people to remember. It's the system. I mean, yeah, we work hard. We're very lucky. I mean, I've had a series of blessings from the time I was a little child. But it's the system that made it possible. Not for everybody. You had to get off your ass and do something. But the point is, it does work. And if you would have to present amazing facts to overturn my opinion on that subject because of my life experience.
Yeah, I run into people all the time, or I encounter writings and opinions of people all the time who talk about previous eras, even pre-Enlightenment eras, right? There was, and they almost always sound like, remember in the 1970s, there were all these people talking about reincarnation. They always talked about how in a past life they were a princess or a general. They never talked about how they were a club-footed serf who died in their childhood. And there is this tendency among people to think that everyone would be better off if we lived in a pre-capitalist system. And their argument almost always boils down to really selfish reasons about how they would be in power and enjoying themselves. It's very weird.
I have a wonderful story from my childhood that addresses exactly that point. I had seen a movie, Ivanhoe was the name of the movie, and it was about the Middle Ages and the knights and the ladies. So I was out pulling weeds with my brother. And my brother was one of the blessings of my life because my brother was wise. He was born an adult. And so we were pulling weeds. And so, as children will do, I said to Don, wouldn't it have been great if we'd lived in the olden days? He had seen the movie too. And he said, well, what would have been so great about it? And I said, well, hell, if we'd been living in the olden days, there'd be servants out here pulling these weeds. We wouldn't be pulling these weeds. And so my brother looked at me and said, don't you realize that if we'd lived in the olden days, we'd have been servants? And it struck me as so profound, even though I was probably 10 years old, that I didn't talk for about 5 minutes. I just thought about it. And you're absolutely right. We think we would have been the kings or princes, but almost all of us would have been the serfs. And just imagine the talent that system wasted.
Yeah.
It's sort of the reason I feel so emotional about school choice. It may not be the be all and end all of life, but it clearly works better than the current education system. And I used to go into these high schools that were in the inner city when I was in the House and Senate and wonder how many people in those schools were like me that had some ability, but it was just never discovered. I didn't learn to read until I was in the 10th grade. My brother took to books, but I had to be inoculated many times. When it took, but I failed the 3rd, 7th, and 9th grades. But in the America I grew up in, and Jonah, it scares me a little bit to say this. Maybe I lived in a golden age. It was very hard to fail in the America I grew up in. You had to make mistake after mistake after mistake. I hope that's true in the future. I don't know.
All right. That's just a great place to end on. I want to thank you, Phil Gramm, for doing this. And I'm going to get Don Boudreaux on here at some point, so we'll get double duty dollars on moving this book. The book is The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism by Don Boudreaux and Phil Gramm. Phil, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for all you do. You're great. You make us laugh at things that are real problems. And that's the best approach.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks very much.